Welcome to the last, but certainly not the least panel we have for today. We've already just had such a fantastic discussion. And, as we were just told from the panel before, we have some really easy questions to solve here in the next 30 minutes. So again, we're here to discuss on this panel the ethics, equity, and regulation around LLMs and ChatGPT in healthcare, with really the true world experts in the topic. And I'm just so curious to hear what they have to say. To introduce myself, I'm Justin Norden. I'm a physician, computer scientist, partner at GSR Ventures, where we focus on early stage digital health investing and investments around AI and healthcare. Additionally, I'm an adjunct professor in the Stanford Center for Bioinformatics Research and teach courses on digital health and this quarter, generative AI and medicine. So it's great to see some of the students here today. I'll start off, and so we do have, at some point, we'll have Glenn, I guess, joining on the screen here. So I'll introduce him, I guess, last. Oh, there he is. But I'll start off with Glenn. So we have Professor Glenn Cohen, Deputy Dean, and James A. Attwood and Leslie Williams, Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, Faculty Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law and Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard University. He's really the world expert at the intersection of health and law. He's advised the VP on healthcare issues before. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Lisa Lehman, Associate Professor of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, Associate Professor of Health Policy and Management, the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, formerly Director of Bioethics and Trust at Google, and formerly Chief Medical Officer for the VA New England Healthcare System. Next, I want to introduce Yohani Salad, the Chief Medical Officer, Managing Director of the AWS Cloud Innovation Center for Digital Health Equity, VP of Digital Health at UC Davis. He's a surgeon by training, a clinical informatics by training, an engineer by background. Can really answer all of those questions. And last but certainly not least, again, we have Troy Tasbaz, who is the Director for Digital Health at the FDA. So we're going to ask him all the easy questions about what he plans to do here. And formerly, he was an SVP at Oracle for 11 years, really kind of moving this kind of cloud transformation effort. With that, I'll kick it off with an easy one. Yohani, we just heard a little bit, there was a challenge, when does it become, not ethical not to use these tools? So, talk us through the potential and kind of what you think is the potential for these tools to really advance health equity and really kind of broaden what our capabilities are.
So to the earlier discussion, right, the question of when it's become non-ethical is when it's so clinically intervened, right, in your clinical decision-making perspective. So when the tool extends you as a clinician to the point where without the tool, the care you provide, right, the variability of your care starts to increase. And when we start to look at about the equity part is, as a practicing clinician, right, and all of you who's practiced, we know that the quality of care you get highly depends where you're getting your care, right? So it's not only you have to have insurance, right? Then you have to be in the right location to get your insurance. And then, okay, two of those parts are correct. And now you are really seeing a specialist. It's also starting to depend on, okay, do you speak the right language? Do you have access to the necessary technology to get access to your medical portal? And so on, right? So there's a lot of the equity barriers, even if you already have access to good quality care. So when we start from a simple part of where we can start leveraging a lot of this technology from the generative AI perspective is establishing the communication and helping our clinician that's already there for you to help care better. Because right now, when we look at UC Davis, for example, and formerly I was at Yale, where the population at Yale is how many languages our patients speak. It's way more than 2 or 3 languages we do support in our patient portal. And then on top of that, how many of those patients who may click that they speak English actually truly speak English on the level that they will be able to comprehend education that you're actually putting forward. Those are type of the questions we currently do not ask and do not connect for. So with a generative AI, with a lot of health literacy parts and a lot of the personalized care delivery and a lot of the cultural care adjustment, we actually truly can unveil the new era of a care delivery.
Look like you want to say something.
Well, I think the question about when it becomes unethical to not use these is fundamentally a question about the standard. right? And I just want to echo the importance of some of, or underscore some of what Nigam said in terms of the need for testing. Right, there's clearly tremendous opportunity here in so many dimensions of healthcare that I'm deeply excited about, from addressing like clinician burnout to increasing productivity to improving health outcomes to empowering patients. Right, to think about the value of this technology in all of these different dimensions of healthcare is astounding. And at the same time, we really need to have good evidence, better understand the risks, and to understand how we can mitigate those risks. Until, we can't say that this is the standard of care until we have that body of evidence. And one of the things that I'm particularly excited about, just from a prior conversation, thinking about here is, I grew up in a lot of the controversy around opioids, and the risks of sharing laboratory with patients. This was just about a decade ago. When you think about the power of generative AI to enhance the information that we're sharing with patients, to interpret genomic data for patients that most primary care clinicians in general can't interpret for patients. It is extremely powerful in terms of information being a determinant. So I think that we need more testing in order to have confidence that we're addressing it, we're not.
Glenn, turning to you, what about, from your perspective, you sit at this kind of intersection. I really don't know where to look. Let's turn this way.
It's okay. I can see you either way. Don't worry. Don't look back.
You sit at this intersection, right, of, ethically what's happening, what's happening now, and then also, what does the law say? So, we'll start to move in that direction. What are your thoughts there?
Okay, so here in no particular order is my top issues to keep an eye out for. The first is just data ownership and consent for use. This has been a typical problem for medical AI in general. But here, where is the data coming from? Where is it being scraped from? Questions about copyright law, questions in Europe about GDPR. Second issue is just privacy. As one of the prior speakers said, most of these are not HIPAA compliant. That means if you put stuff in it about a patient, that is stuff that you may be violating HIPAA by asking and querying the system. Third is just informed consent and the right to know we're dealing with medical AI. We've already seen chatbots in the mental health space experiment with having ChatGPT help formulate prompts and responses to patients. Do patients need to have a right to know and be told that they're dealing with a medical AI in this instance, the more human-like it feels? Fourth, medical deepfakes. And this is probably the one I don't think we're talking about the most. We have lots of people who are doubtful about vaccines, for example. I can easily generate something published in the New England Journal of Medicine with seemingly good citations that show that mRNA vaccines cause sterility, and I can pass that out. I can basically convince you that much of the data you're seeing is medical data and is real when it's not through ChatGPT. That's something to worry about. Fifth, oligopoly. Right now, it may turn out that large language models have to be very large to compete in this market. And in a world where we have one or two, we have Coke or we have Pepsi, there's much more of a risk of homogenization of foundational models, as well as licensing and control. Sixth, environmental. What are the carbon costs of these models? And then finally, one piece of good news, right? Just to give you some good news at the end. There's a real potential here for democratization of knowledge and patient empowerment. I think the most obvious usages for ChatGPT at the moment are for patients before they see their physicians, to learn a lot and to prepare for the kinds of questions they should ask. But I'm a lawyer, there's always an asterisk and a but. The but piece is, it turns out, physicians are going to have a script to know how to deal with that, and also have to know how to deal with patients that are curating what they're telling the physician based on what ChatGPT has told them.
Good. I want to follow up with one more on that last point. And Troy, get ready. You threw out a few challenges that will come to you in a second. But okay, so let's talk about before the visit. From your kind of legal perspective, right? We're okay with Google putting up some information on your disease. Now we start taking in your symptoms. We start taking in your history. We're giving you more. Just again, we saw our blanket liability statement in front. What's your take on how far you can go? Where is that line in your mind today? Then we'll get Troy.
Yeah, you can disclaim all you want to. I don't think the disclaimers are going to do much of the work. And my colleague from FDA will probably tell you FDA looks at intended use. What's the intended use of a drug or a device or something out there in the market, whether it's a general wellness product versus something that has to actually be a device. And if you posit it to patients that what you're doing is giving them medical advice, you are engaged in the unauthorized practice of medicine. And on the other hand, there's a real risk that unlike Google, which shows you a bunch of links and you know that you're not getting a definitive answer, you're getting a bunch of different perspectives and click through. Here with ChatGPT, you're given an answer that is presented as kind of definitive in a way. So I do think the risk of patient misunderstanding is great, but at the same time, patients are a lot smarter than we've given them credit for. People were worried about this in the Dr. Google era, and it's turned out that for the most part, I think patients have felt pretty good and physicians have felt pretty good about the empowerment. So I'm more optimistic than I am worried.
Fantastic. We'll try it. You've chosen an interesting moment in history, right? You've been coming from the tech side for a number of years now, and kind of recently joined the FDA to lead this effort, and now are swept up in kind of changing technology in a way that certainly I've never seen before. So just like help orient us. We've thrown, you've heard 10, 15 questions before, but just help orient us to kind of where you are now. How are you organizing your thinking, starting to approach these questions around regulation of schools?
So, by the way, it's a very interesting moment in time that ethics and regulation is a hot topic in Silicon Valley these days, which is why I'm at FDA. So, who has heard about a Medical Device Regulation Act? Anyone? Okay, that's like a few people. So, on May 28th, we're going to be celebrating its 47th year history. Why this is important is because that's what we use to regulate artificial intelligence. To see if we can influence change, or at least influence some flexible regulatory that we can apply to something that is not typically a medical device. And why that's important is that if you think about a medical device, the traditional sense of a medical device, it's a manufacturing process, right? You don't release a device with features, right? You release a complete set of a device. Now, artificial intelligence or software, we don't release that as a complete package. Right? It's not a complete product. And artificial intelligence is adaptive. So we have to have regulations that have to be adaptive. And that's not the traditional model of legislators to think about that. So the approach that I've been taking since I've been there is that, I could probably try to influence legislation, but the reality is that it might not be in my lifetime. So you have to effectively think about things differently, because, we talk about the various issues. You have ways around as practice. What I was doing, clearly, arguments about vaccination. But right. What am I? And we went. Hey, so we so what I that, that you're that, uh, last
So we talked a little about kind of your background going from, industry now to the regulatory side. But Lisa, you also have a very unique background kind of as a medical ethicist, also jumping over to Google and seeing how, Silicon Valley, a Silicon Valley company, starts to think about these issues. So curious to hear your perspective on that, especially given, what's being done now, the questions before about, what Bard would talk about versus what Bard wouldn't talk about. So curious to hear where you come from on that end.
Sure. So I think from both an academic perspective, a government perspective, and industry perspective, people generally, right? That's there's clearly some bad actors in society, and we need to be thoughtful about thinking about ways in which those potentials might seep into things. But in general, I at least from my experience working, there is a real desire to use this technology. And the question then becomes, well, how do we do that? And what are the that people need to be thinking about? And what are the risks that we anticipate as a result of that? And I think Glenn shared with us some of the concerns. I think that broadly speaking, there are ethical frameworks. There are multiple out there from organizations like NIST to there's the White House blueprint for AI in healthcare. The WHO has frameworks. There's lots of frameworks, and I would say there are common principles in all of these frameworks. Things like transparency, safety, reliability, accountability. But as Troy mentioned, part of the challenge is how do you operationalize those things? So both in industry environment as well as an academic environment, whether you're talking about industry that's developing the foundation models, tools that are then going to be fine-tuned for academic environment, healthcare, or we're talking about a healthcare system that is interested in the end-to-end implementation of AI to improve patients' outcomes, to address burnout, to empower patients. Right? There's the important question of how do we operationalize all of the ethical principles, and really privileged to be able to work with many of the people in this room who are part of the health AI that's important, that more foundation also supports, that is trying to bring people together to have alignment, working with the National Academy of Medicine, as well as industry groups, academia, government, to bring everybody together, have a coherent framework for how we can operationalize this so that we're ensuring that we're mitigating the risks and that we're ultimately bringing the benefits of AI to patients. So I think that the hope is to bring everybody together.
And I think an important point here from a lot of the healthcare system is how we do all of that we still maintaining the velocity of the move. Because we know that, as a large institution, we can create a big bureaucratic oversight and go detailed line by line through every algorithm. A lot of healthcare systems looking at an FDA clearance and say, it's good, but we also have our own set of questions, which create an incredible additional burden on the innovation and internal projects. So, and the question here, it's actually becoming a very interesting one because at some particular point, we know there is no way of stopping patients to following TikToks, right? From snapping their own lab results and trying to get some of the answers or doing something else. So us right now being stuck in some of the internal oversight potentially create additional risk of they either following misinformation or following, frankly, some of the large language models that's been put by some of the actors that may not be as validated and giving them already information that they shouldn't really be acting on. So I think one of the main questions that we're certainly trying to solve at UC Davis is how we do both of that, how we create a safe oversight ecosystem that follow all of those guidelines that's recently been published, as well as ensure that the velocity and the speed of movements is actually fast to ensure we're capturing the growing demand.
And I would just add to that to say that the oversight mechanism or a governance structure that exists both locally in a healthcare system or regionally or nationally will actually accelerate, I think, the ethical implementation of AI. Right? So that kind of governance system and oversight with a registry of all the algorithms, clarity about how do we validate these algorithms, are they tested for bias, and what's the data behind them, do we have the data provenance and the traceability of it? All of those factors and that kind of oversight process is going to help us do this ethically and accelerate the process, which is, one of my biggest fears is that sometimes the ethics is an afterthought. But if we recognize that there's value to ultimately to the end product coming to patients, if we stop and integrate the ethics early on, we're actually going to be better.
It is an interesting place we're in right now because we have to really truly expand the parameters of what governance really is, right? It can't be just the regulatory agency that is actually providing governance. This has to come down to the ethical issues of the person who's actually developing the product as well, knowing that this is going to potentially impact human life, right? So, but I do actually want to really feed off on the last panel around how do you actually target some investments? And I think we're starting with product innovation instead of process innovation. And I believe that's where we should be applying some of the intellectual capacity towards. And what I mean by that is that we're trying to find, solutions to very sexy things like how do we cure cancer, right? Or can we say, how do we actually improve the process around what a patient goes through from a life cycle? That could be, agnostic of the disease itself. Or how do we actually reduce the stress of some of the medical professionals? And, if you do actually some of the times that they're spending on administrative work, which I think it's been suggested somewhere around 30% of their actual weekly time that they spend at work, they might be able to see better patients, more patients. They might actually be able to give better patient care, which is why I believe most medical professionals have actually chosen to begin with. Right? So I'm actually a firm believer that we probably need to start prioritizing how we, quantify or qualify investments that are going into this area. And it's interesting because, I think this is where the developer community and the medical community really need to start getting together. Majority of the time, I actually don't think that they talk to one another, nor do they actually speak the same language. And that's part of the problem. And we've seen this with the amount of wasted investments that have gone into this, both from the startup community, but also very large companies that went into this field and came out of this field multiple times.
Just a small pessimistic comment. Unfortunately, I wish, right, that every time we get additional efficiency, we give it back to clinician to spend more time with the patient. But as a lot of the virtual scribe examples showed us, the usual equation is how many additional patients can you see per day, right? So we have to be very careful to avoid the same way to look on that because ultimately we're not addressing burnout. We're just actually increasing throughput, right, and potentially increasing.
Can I add a slightly more pessimistic comment, which is as follows? I'm a lawyer, so I have to be very pessimistic, which is to say we're in the midst of a race dynamic, both between large companies, but also between the US and China in particular. And in race dynamics, ethics is often seen as a constraint on winning the race. And that's just not a great place to be in terms of thinking about ethical governance.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, just to do this race dynamic, because it's not just, US and China, it's startups have been created over the past few months at a rate that, has been incredible, right? What 2 students can build and launch in a weekend has now launched forward kind of with the use of these new tools. And so, we can come up with the best frameworks and ideas and things we want to address all these issues, but what do we need to prioritize? Because things are moving technologically faster than we've seen. I won't even mention the site launched last week that just kind of put a lot of these tools out online that anyone is using now. And there is a disclaimer there, but it's pretty weak. So like, what do we need to do first as a field to make sure this happens when there is a race going on to kind of get out first with these technologies?
Well, I was just going to say, I think the industry that's developed or the startups need to integrate ethics from the start, from the get-go, right? Ethics, equity, privacy, all need to be embedded into the development of the technology at the end. I'm reminded of a great cartoon that was in the New Yorker, I think, a while back with a roller coaster picture of the double helix DNA genomics, kind of looking at genomics with ethics way behind and genomics far out. And I think that's where consumer AI, where the ethics.
So I used to joke that I cheated on my ethics exam and I still got a C, but doesn't make any sense. So last year, there were about $6 billion of investments that went into artificial intelligence-based healthcare startups. It's projected that it's going to go up to about $65 billion in the next 3 to 4 years. And generally speaking, ethics, cybersecurity, these are not in the lexicon of most developers, right? This is one of the problems because, again, it constrains them from the creativity that they actually want to do. And not to mention a startup doesn't have that type of capital to actually invest into ethics, people, or cybersecurity. So therefore, it's kind of a chicken versus the egg problem that we see. But if I just use those numbers, think about the stress that it's going to actually put on the system itself, both from a regulation perspective, but also from a confusion of a hospital system having to say, okay, well, how do I even integrate this thing? Where do I even start? And maybe this is really not an issue for regulation. Well, it is an issue for regulation because the amount of new products that we're going to have to evaluate are going to significantly grow. But maybe it is the investment community that is a little bit more judicious about how they invest. That is actually one of the things why I went to FDA is like, because I want to have those conversations. And I'm not suggesting that I want to tell people where to invest. But I think that if you actually demonstrate where the big public health needs are, and the big public health needs are, if you haven't heard this, there's something called the quintuple aim. Use that as a guidance around how you actually think about products, right? The quintuple aims are better patient experience, better medical professional experience, lower costs, better outcomes, and 2 years ago, they added health equity. And use that maybe to guide around how your product development should be and where the investment should go. So, my concern is that it's going to cause a lot of stress. So I think, ethical considerations are obviously a very big consideration, but the issue is, I think, much grander at this point.
So it's actually interesting. I think the speed of a lot of new startups generation is absolutely fascinating. But I think the interesting part here is it's almost feel like we're entering the new era completely, right? And we still have the older problem, older mindset, right? And we enter the new era, got a new tool, and we're like, oh, now we can solve all those older problems. And it's actually not a good way to think about it, because a lot of those problems and the smaller thing that we used to try to solve with a previous generation technology, not going to be a significant pain point alone. It's become commodity very fast. So a lot of the way we think about the products and the way we think about some of the innovation kind of change. And a lot of the smaller point of care solution, and we already as a healthcare system looking through all this point solution, trying to not implement any of them and trying to go in a platform, because a lot of them will not be sustainable. A lot of them will go away or will be acquired. But the real question is, where do we see the clinical trend going, right? Like, where do you see there is a big need for the clinical augmentation for the care that we do provide? And I think to earlier panels, as a clinician, we know we need a better autopilot. Right now, what do we have? We have a search that's maybe semantic, may not be, but very often I may not even know that patient did some echo in the past. And now this clinical decision is not in front of me, right? So when we start going into the better information retrieval, better assistance, then we automatically start to go into some care augmentation and automation. And that's where a lot of the new models of care will start to come up, because we're still stuck in this one-to-one, maybe different channel care. We're still not thinking in the one-to-many care, where we can actually start to leverage a lot of the technology that's coming to deliver the true higher quality and equitable care.
Well, with that, that brings us to the end of our time. I think we probably answered all the questions. I don't think anyone has any other questions. But again, really, and even putting this whole day together, part of the hope was that we can start this discussion, because this is a discussion this whole community here online, the country really needs to have. But I'll invite Kurt back up to end us off before we go to our drinks and happy hour.
Well, I learned a ton today. I hope you all did too. And I was asked to summarize. It seems an impossible task. So many insights from today. For patients, in our patient session, what struck me is a lot of the thinking that I came in with was, how is this technology going to help us engage with our patients, explain things better to our patients? But there really were some important considerations about patients interacting directly with these systems and what that means for patient privacy. And I think there's some work that we need to do there. Nothing about me without me. I think that applies to large language models even more than many other technologies. For physicians, I heard a lot about simplifying information management. A lot of the tasks that physicians do that aren't at the top of their license, clerical type tasks, things that cause burnout. And these technologies have the potential to help physicians work more efficiently, for organizations for which they work to retain them, because they have these technologies that create a better work environment for physicians. I didn't hear nearly as much about decision support and differential diagnosis as I thought I might hear. And in fact, many of the risk areas we heard about related more to that area of differential diagnosis and diagnostic decision support. I found the regulatory and policy issues fascinating. Something that I guess was implicit in our whole discussion is that we, unlike many other areas where these language models are being applied, already are a regulated industry. So that, I think, is going to help us in some ways. It's almost funny to say the regulations are going to help us, but we did hear that governance and regulation can accelerate implementation and can create a race to the top where everyone in the ecosystem is trying to build better and more capable systems. I think that's a really important insight, that in some ways that safe and effective bar that we need to clear once we get to a certain risk area where maybe there's not a human in the loop anymore, that is very helpful in many ways to us. I found the issue of oligopoly very interesting. We didn't really have a chance to dive into that, but I think that's important that we, today, these models are coming from places that have immense resources that can train them. But I think we're already starting to see some open source options, some ways to shrink these models to where they're small, but they're still quite effective and can solve many of the problems that we talked about today. And finally, the race dynamic is something I think we all need to keep in mind, that we have companies in races with each other. We have countries in races with each other. I think that generally the ecosystem has been fair and cautious in the way that these models have been rolled out so far, but the leaders that we have today may not be the leaders we have tomorrow, and there may be new companies. There may be, dynamics that could be troublesome in that area. So that's my summary. I'm sure you all have your own summaries. We all learned a lot, I hope, and I'm glad you all were able to be here, both in person and online. A few logistical things I want to close with. Number one, I hope you will all consider attending our Aimi Symposium, which will be held on June 8th. It's a hybrid meeting. We do have sessions on large language models there. That's our kind of seminal annual meeting. So please do attend and register if you're interested in that at all. We will be, for those of you in the room here in this beautiful Gates building here on the Stanford campus, we will be having a reception immediately after in just a moment. So I hope you'll all stay for that. And then when you do leave the building, please, if you wouldn't mind, leave your badges at the desk so that we can recycle those appropriately. Again, thank you all for being here. I thought it was a fantastic meeting. I want to thank number one, the organizers. So Joanna, Kim, the Aimi staff, and all the High staff, thank you so much for making this all possible. And I want to also thank our organizers, the moderators of the panel, all the panelists, the audience here and online, as I said, and also thank our sponsors, Aimi and High, and our co-sponsors, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and GSR Ventures. So again, thank you everyone, and enjoy the reception.